Bonjour, bienvenue sur la zone entrepreneuriale de la Jeune Chambre de commerce de Montréal. Je m'appelle Enya Bouchard et je suis avec Jeunes diplomates du Canada. Hello and welcome back. For those who are joining us the first time as the Junior Chamber of Commerce of Montreal, Entrepreneur Zone, my name is Enya and I'm with Young Diplomats of Canada. So before I introduce our next session, just a reminder that at the end you can come front to the microphone and ask your question. So now please give it up for our speakers. First of all, we have David Roy, founder and executive director of Workshop for Biodiversity. The next one is Alexandre Beaudoin, co-founder and director of research, Éco-Pivot. We also have Nina Lantiga, president, Nets for Net Zero, G20 YEA Canadian delegate. And last but not least, we have Oki Gonzalez-Gizon, founder of Akara Climate. Have a nice discussion.
Everyone, thank you for being here today. We only have 20 minutes, literally. We just had a chat before that lasted around an hour. So we won't have that much time for questions, but I think most of you are staying after, so feel free to come chat with us. We'll be happy to take all of your questions. We will still try to have a bit of time for one or two questions, but just so we know that. So today we're here to talk about biodiversity, or what we can call nature. Talking about nature can be quite devastating. We're losing all our wetlands. 70% of land surface has been modified by humans. We all know about climate change. Well, I think we do. It can be quite depressing. But what we want to do today is actually talk about action, thinking about, okay, what can we do about it? How do we change that relationship with nature so that we don't feel depressed when we leave this room. So I'm so glad to have you guys. I'm not going to present you. It's been done already. Go read their profile on the app. All amazing. It will take me 25 minutes just to present. Alexandre, thank you. Oki, thank you. Nina, thank you so much. So we know all the problem. There's problem with nature. We need to change the relationship with nature. You've been lucky enough that you've decided to found an organization around the ecological crisis. Can you tell us more about it? So I give you 1 or 2 minutes. Can you tell me why did you decide to found an organization that really focus on those issues? Nina, I want to get started?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Well, it's great to be here and to be talking on this subject because obviously something we're all very passionate about. But to try and summarize, not to go too long into childhood, but I grew up in a big city, but I was always very connected to nature. Thanks to people like David Suzuki are here and taught us about that in our homes. But sort of if we accelerate, at a very young age, I realized I was obsessed with whales, and I went to marine biology camp, informed myself as much as possible, and then fast forward many years, I was very aware of the impact pollution was having on marine biodiversity. So it's something that I was just passionate about as a kid, and then as I grew older and went into entrepreneurship, worked in research and psychology, nothing to do with what I do now, but all of those sets of experiences really inspired me when I saw that there was an opportunity. So I saw, okay, there's, in Canada we have the longest coastlines in the world. We now know that ghost fishing gear is one of the leading causes of death of great whales and kills about 10% of life underwater. So through connecting those dots and seeing an opportunity to design solutions, working with different experts was really what inspired Nets for Net Zero. So today I'm very proud to say that we work with multiple stakeholders across the whole chain to really create that circular economy, from fish net producers to fishers, and to then companies who can use these recycled plastics into new products. So it's all of that put together that really inspired me to launch Nets for Net Zero, and all the people around this system that make it happen.
Thank you. Alex?
Yeah, okay. Well, on our side with Éco-Pivot, we have a different scale of action, I think so. On my side, the motivation, as a biologist, I always wanted to take care of biodiversity. It was in my DNA. And I spent a lot of time just presenting to the new generation ideas, making them love what they have around them, try to create these situations, seeing a butterfly, having a moment with a plant, and taking care of the home we are living in. So it's really important for me. But at some point, as a teacher at Université de Montréal in biodiversity management, also as an animator with kids, I always have to talk about the problems. We want to talk about biodiversity, we have to talk about all the problems, the sources of these problems. So it's always a bit negative, as we were saying earlier, almost depressive. So I wanted to be able to present them like positive actions, things that we can do it at our scales. So this is why I was saying we have different scales of actions. On our side, Éco-Pivot is reconnecting nature to city. We want to reconnect green spaces, creating green corridors in the city, and presenting these things with schools, with kids, with people. They can just be part of it. So it's a way to present the problems, but in the same discourse, we're able to get to the action. So this is why I made this the jump into the entrepreneur thing.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. So for me, it all started during a trip, a family trip in Peru. So in my father's side, we are Peruvian with two indigenous communities, so Quechua and Machiguenga. And there's a saying in Quechua, it said, Pachamamaj Wajarinin. And that means the call of the Mother Earth. And that's something I've realized a bit before COVID. So I went in Peru, in the Cusco region, working with my grandfathers on the fields. And that's my first connection with nature in the field, in agriculture, working on cacao and cocoa and mango farms. And I've realized during that time how climate change is impacting agriculture. So then COVID happened, I came back here, and I was just trying to find a way to tackle the climate change impact in agriculture. And that's how I've started Climate. So at Climate, what we do is we are trying to assess the risk of climate change in nature on agriculture. So forecasting crop yield and losses with a more holistic view, like replicating a complete agronomic ecosystem.
Thank you so much. Really great to hear from your project. Obviously, not everybody in the room has founded an organization around biodiversity or around climate, so we have different positions. That's actually what we do at Workshop for Biodiversity, try to say, okay, everybody can play a role, but how exactly do we make that? Because I see all your profiles, you've all grown up loving natures, like there's no question of value of nature, you love it. How do we actually act in businesses where it's not our main mission, we're not about biodiversity, we have other goals with maybe social, it may be economics. So how do we act? How can we be part of the equation where nature gets regenerated and we actually change that relationship with nature? Anybody wants to start? How do we do that when we're not founding an organization around it?
I can, yeah, I'll start it. All right. I mean, that's a big question. I think we could talk about that for at least an hour. But look, I always look at it from a supply chain perspective. And looking at that, and like I was saying earlier, working with fishnet producers. So like those fishnet producers, they're based in India. They create these fishnets that are then sold in Canada and used by fishers here. So at the end of the day, no matter what kind of business you have an impact. And the first step is understanding that. And I think that's something we all know, that we need to measure impact. But then how do we go about that? Where do we start enacting change? And first we need to understand where we can have the most impact. And sometimes we think, okay, well, I'm a service-based company or whatever. I don't have an impact. Well, you're using computers, you're using emissions, that requires cooling. We all have an impact somewhere. So first understanding that, but looking beyond, there's this concept of, some may be familiar, like scope 1, 2, 3 emissions. So if we look at it from an emissions perspective, scope 1 is, okay, what are my direct activities? And then to scope 3, my suppliers. So part of that, I think, is having the conversation to start to understand where that is, because at the end of the day, everything has an impact on climate change, everything has an impact on biodiversity. So take a hard look at yourself, or your company, or whatever, but look from the inside and see where are we acting, how can we minimize waste, because that can also save costs. Like there's multiple benefits to transitioning to circular systems. We just haven't uncovered all of them yet, and sometimes that requires innovation. So don't be afraid to innovate in that thinking and in that process.
Thank you.
I will bring more the financial step point on the question. So, for example, with Climate, what we are trying to do is, we're not working directly with farmers. We work more with agricultural financial institutions. So the idea is to measure how climate change will impact their own financial performance, so the profitability. If you talk with the same language as different organizations, you can bring them in the transition, the sustainable transition of the society. I can give you an example on climate change. For example, if we have different climate scenarios, so the average temperature will increase by the end of the century. So there's some impact directly on weather. If if like precipitation, there's an increase of precipitation, you will see a decrease of crop yield. So you can measure that aspect, that impact, and that's something financial. So then the banks, if they see, okay, the losses will be much more bigger than today, how can we support farmers to finance and make the sustainable transition to become more resilient on the topic of climate change? On biodiversity, there's another way you can assess those type of financial risks. For example, in agriculture, pollinators play a central role. So if you lose all the pollinators in one specific region, you will see a decrease of crop yield. So again, you can measure that aspect, that impact, and go back to those big corporations and say, you're gonna lose money in the future in 10 years, so take action today. And then they are more open to invest and to be supportive of the climate adaptation.
On that point, I was talking with Aoki just before the panel, and I introduced this topic, finance and biodiversity, into my class, the second degree students. And at the first class, when I say, well, on the 5th session, we're going to talk about finance, all the students are like, what about finance and biodiversity? Why are you doing this? Why I have to read an article on this thing? But it is one of the places who have the more action, can have the best action to change the world, I think so. And I think my students are convinced at the end of that, of the experience. That wasn't my point. The nature is the responsibility of everyone. So we all have something to do at our scale. If it's your home, if it's your company, you have a place, you live on the land, so you are responsible of this land. In cities, we work in cities, almost everything is private. So we have to convince people, let's do something on your piece of land. First thing is to be able to know what you have on your land. So sometimes you think you don't have anything. You have a parking lot with a few trees, but maybe you have 3 different species. Maybe you have a special tree on your land. Maybe you have insects that are really important. So first thing is to get to know what you have. So let's try to do an inventory. We can do it with the group. Make some volunteering. So go with the biologists and try to learn a bit about what you have on your land, on your piece of land. And then you'll find out that you can do something really cool and have opportunities and responsibilities around these species or example of biodiversity. The idea also is because we are proposing ecological corridor, sometimes you just have to take time to see, are we on a really big project? Are we part of this really big project? I see an ecological corridor as a really big puzzle, and everybody has a little piece to put on the table to create this corridor. I'm not able to convince every actor to do something, but the more times it goes, the more we talk about biodiversity in the media, people are really convinced now, more convinced than 10 years ago. So maybe we can try to convince your neighbors or your boss at your company to say, maybe we have something bigger than us that we can work on. It won't be on our land, but we can just give a hand on the next project in the park, for example. So this is what we're trying to do with the companies, like bring people with us, make the inventories, they will know, and when you know and you love what you have around you, you will try to protect it. So.
Thank you so much. You've talked about CEOs of business looking at it. You've done kind of the same thing, supply chain, looking at it. You're talking about university student. We kind of see it as a privilege thing. Like, I'm obviously not the right person to talk. I'm a white middle-aged man from Canada that has the dominant language. But how do you make sure that when you work on projects like yours, that you actually involve local communities or First Nation? Because you work with fishing, obviously, indirectly. You work with agriculture, so it's actually local communities that usually own those land, work with those resources. So how do you work with them to make sure that your solution is actually inclusive? I don't get it started.
Yeah, for us, it's been our way of doing things since the beginning because that's just what made sense. Often we see examples of imposing solutions, and that doesn't work. It doesn't work because you don't understand what those communities, what their challenges are, what's a win for them. So it's as simple as having a conversation. I'm someone who loves talking, clearly, but jokes aside, I'll give an example that we talked about before the panel, but I think this story is very telling. So when we first started Nets for Net Zero, I was speaking to fishers, of course, in Canada. I was like, we're going to do Canada, circular economy, longest coastlines in the world, let's go. And so speaking to fishers on the Atlantic coast, a lobster fisher in particular, and this is where I was learning, like, a lot of the areas they fish, it's knowledge that's been passed down from generation to generation. And so these things are secret. So when we're looking at things like traceability, they're like, well, we don't want you to know where we fish, because then the other guys are going to come steal our lobster. But anyways, through these conversations, I learned that, and also the fact that there's no more lobster to fish like there was before, a few generations back. And so they're seeing the impact of ghost gear on the economic returns of their fishing practices. And so now this lobster fisher in particular fishes lobster cages. And then, we work with different partners to recycle some of that. And then, fast forward to just over a year ago, when I had the opportunity to go to India as part of the G20 Summit, or Young Entrepreneur Alliance Summit, and took the opportunity to meet with some fishers there. And what fascinated me is that I'm across the world in a completely different culture. They always say, going to India is going to be your biggest culture shock. And the funny thing is yes, there's culture shocks, the noise, the honking, all of that, but the fishers had the same stories. And they told, this particular fisher told me this story about a great whale that they found with, I think, 70 tons of plastics in its stomach. And he, I was with him on his boat, and he's taking his net, throwing it in the water, and you see plastic coming out. And then I asked him, I was like, what do you do with that plastic? Do you bring it back? And he's like, well, no, I put it back in the water. And I'm like, well why? And he's like, well, there's no space on my boat, and so if I bring that back, I can't bring fish back, and then I can't feed my family. But without having that moment in that conversation, I never would have seen that. So I thought, okay, well, can we create a system? And they're like, we want solutions. We don't want to be the bad guys. And so that's where it starts. It's having those honest conversations, understanding where these people are coming from, because I never could have guessed that. So I think that's critical to enabling these solutions and ensuring that we're creating those wins on every level.
I may ask Alex, I think you've worked with First Nation too. What can we learn from them? Because again, we have lots of issues here, we know that, so how do you collaborate with them on your projects?
I've been working on different projects since the last 3 years, so it's quite new for me. The first thing is not to focus on the project you want to deliver. It's the process that counts. So the way everybody are able to exchange in a respectful way, listening to each other. Maybe you'll pass over, in my case, summers and spring are super important to put the plans. If you miss it, you'll have to wait another year. But sometimes it's a good idea to wait 1 more year and 2 years before you get the first shovel movement, because it's really important to be able to consider the point of view of everyone. So it's not the project. This is the main thing. When I'm working myself, when I'm working on this project, I'm not the project manager. I consider that I accompanies the idea that we're all working on together. The two-eyed seeing, maybe you all know about it, but I will also read it because it's a sentence that really make an echo in my head when I read it first. It refers to learning to see from one eye with the strength of indigenous knowledge and the other eye with the strength of Western knowledge. So we have to consider both sides at the same time. So if everybody at the table is able to get this posture, I think you'll get a good project. So this is how I work on these things. So it's a way of being more than a way to do things.
Thank you. That seems like a lot of work. So how do you actually, because I see you guys like trying to build those beautiful projects. I think we need more business like yours, but what do we need from the actual business ecosystem, from politics? Because there's a reason why we don't see more of your type of business. It's because it's hard. You look pretty happy today, but I'm sure you had some rough nights. So how do we have a better ecosystem around us that actually facilitate the creation of businesses like that? Or even how do we actually change the business that we have right now? So politically, ecosystem. Okay, do you want to start maybe?
I guess so. So I think don't wait for governments. They're kind of slow, and they just like to put a structure when they don't control everything. Just try to innovate and innovate on the. I'm from the finance standpoint, so I will always talk about if you can communicate the profitability of your impact project, people gonna put money on your project. So the project won't be just an idea, but something real with a real impact, impacting people, impacting biodiversity, impacting nature. So it's the innovation. Measure the financial impacts for those people, measure how we can be profitable, and then mobilize people around those topics. We're still in the capitalism system. Just play with the games, and then we can talk about how we can reform and completely rethink the system.
May I jump in? We had also had this chat before we were on the stage. The eco-sense. What we discovered with Éco-Pivot is that we were missing data to support our suggestion to put new landscape and new green infrastructure in the city. So we created this little thing called eco-sense, which is in the category of green tech. But we are a non-profit organization. This is a problem. When we have ideas and you want to find subventions and go further with your ideas, but you're not there for profit, it's super difficult to knock at the good door and find a program in the government that is open to finance green tech that is not focusing on profit. But as a non-profit organization, we focus on values and mission. So it's super intense. What we were trying during a year to keep our ideas into the non-profit organization. Finally, we changed our mind and we decided to create an Inc. just because we wanted to get this money and be able to create this eco-sense. The eco-sense, like, if I give it to you and you walk in the city, you'll be able to capture data around like carbon dioxide or even temperature, humidity, noise, and at the exact moment, instantaneously, you'll get a map and you'll see where are the hot spots of the fine particles and everything. So it really helps you to see the invisible. It's useful for everyone. And then we are able to say maybe the first place you have to act is on this part of the city because you'll have like a public health enhancement. So let's move into this direction. But we have to be Inc. to do so for the government, which is, for me, a really big problem.
Thank you. Nina?
Yeah, I'll try to summarize. There's so many good points and things I want to jump up from what you were just saying. But I mean, I think one big struggle, and we see that a lot, is that like we started off as a not-for-profit, but now we're looking at the for-profit model as well. And we see tons of companies doing that because you're limited in different ways. So do we need new types of business structures as we're looking at new business models for the future? Absolutely. And then who structures that? Well, it's government. But I'll also speak to sort of some of the, there's the business ecosystem, there's the clean tech, and I'm trying to see how do I summarize all this in a couple of minutes. But like when we look at clean tech development, it can typically take 5 to 7 years. And so if you're looking at VC and those kind of investments and just the profit margins, like we're selling essentially recycled plastics at the end of the day. And we can get into credits, but you're not going to see the 90% margin that a VC needs. And so the for-profit model doesn't necessarily work when you're trying to scale a solution very early on. So there's a huge gap between, okay, very, very early stage, you might win a couple competitions, get a bit of money, leverage that with some government funds if you're creative, and your idea checks a few boxes that it needs to check. And then so you'll be able to get started, but to really scale your solution, that's where there's a really big gap, anyways, in Canada, and definitely if we look at other countries around the world. So how do you support that financially? When you're working with models that don't have a clear ROI because they're new. We don't have historical data on circular plastics, really. Like, we know what virgin plastics, like new plastic, costs. But anyway, so I'm giving some specific examples, but I think the other important piece to that is having that dialogue with government. And part of what I love about the G20 Young Entrepreneur Alliance is that's exactly what we do there. And so we build recommendations, and I lead the policy task force for sustainability and climate and energy for Canada in that organization. And so learning from other entrepreneurs is amazing because you see all those challenges, then we build that, we see, okay, what's going on in other countries? How do we build a cohesive sort of set of recommendations, and then we bring that to government. We say, hey, here's what entrepreneurs think. Here's how we're trying to change the world. Here's how we're trying to have an impact, and here's how you can concretely support us. And they do listen, and that dialogue is very, very rich, and I have seen policy change. It does take time. It's a long, long process, but it does work. And I think also what's important for us is to also listen to what the government has to say and what's their challenges to find, some common ground in all of that. So it's slow, but that conversation is where it starts, I think.
Thank you so much, Nina. As you can see, next time we're going to invite you to the speaker lounge because all the conversation happened there. Thank you so much. Just want to acknowledge that you're in this meeting, you're looking at something about nature. We may not have convinced you to do anything because you're sitting here, so you know about it. But you're the best advocate. So you've mentioned having the conversation, talking the language. just go do it. You're the best advocates. You go and you have that conversation with the financial guy that needs to know that there's a risk. You go for nature walk with the community around you. So you're the best advocates. So I think you can. I'm going to pass you the puck, hockey term, so Canadian of me, and you can be the advocate. So thank you so much for being in the panel. We'll take literally 5 minutes for a question, if you have any question. As we said, we will be here after, so if you want to have a question for one of the specific speakers, again, thank you so much for joining us today. Really grateful. Any questions?
Yes, I have one question, Pierre, from BMW. In order to drive good and effective biodiversity-related decisions as a customer or as a company, would be very helpful to have a measurement. Yeah? And unlike CO2, which is equally bad wherever it takes place, it's very difficult to calculate the local effects of biodiversity. And especially if you look in the supply chain, it's very important to know about the biodiversity effects, which are locally quite different. Do you see any way to approach this?
I may jump in just quickly. I think there's two things. I think we're never going to have the full answer for biodiversity because it's so complex. I think there's lots of ambition. We need to have those really big conversations about value of nature. I think working with research center, working with nonprofits, we're usually quite happy to help. We're working with private sector. Sometimes we become private sector, but there's more and more research. I know here in Quebec, there's lots of research around, okay, how do we actually assess what's a good investment or not? So I think working with research center is such a strong thing to do because there's now the TNFD, as you know, there's a few things coming, but yes, the data is missing, and Alex, you mentioned that, so you may jump on it. But I think working with nonprofit and research is a good way to actually tap into that knowledge that business don't have, because you're not a biodiversity expert, you'll never be, but there is people on the market that do that for a living. So really those calibration, those conversations are key, I think. And I think, Aki, you wanted to jump in.
So right now we don't have a value on biodiversity, but you can start with the natural capital protocol. So they divide the nature risk in two categories. You have impact, so how your business activities will impact nature and ecosystem services. And the other part, it's dependency with the ecosystem services. And all the framework, it's organized depending of industries and sub-industries. So you have specific materiality topics, and you can start the discussion inside the organization with the natural capital protocol. It's a good start. It's not perfect, but let's play.
Any other questions? Right?
Hi, I'm Pallavi, and I'm representing Airbus Canada here. My question was, like, with the rapidly growing population of the world, I'll confine myself to Canada per se. With the recent housing crisis we are also seeing a growth in the requirement for the linear infrastructure. That means we need roads, energy, networks. It's a government project that has been taken to expand, and I have read that we are extending to the wetlands, the forests, to provide for the rapidly increasing immigration population. How do we, in this rapidly growing need of infrastructure, strike a balance with also, saving the biodiversity, restoring our forestation? So what is the right strategy to approach to this balance?
With urban sprawl and all the problems that goes with it and density, it's an important thing. But I think if we add into the equation the mental health and public health in general, and seeing that we do need to keep this contact with nature, even if you want to pay a less amount of money per month for your apartment, you deserve a contact with nature. So we have to add this thing into the way we developed our cities. Right now we're trying to influence a really big project here in Montreal, 43 hectares of not developed land for now, Hippodrome de Montréal. And we would like to, of course, be able to accompany the development of social logements sociaux. Housing, merci. And be able to present the idea that we have a beautiful biodiversity there, so we have to keep it and offer it as a complement of the living of these persons. So this is a game, and for real right now, I think the decision makers are open to have this conversation.
Thank you.
If I just add a quick thing on top of it, I think it's really important also that we will always be part of nature. So sometimes we say save biodiversity, have the humankind next to it. So I think it's really key to consider that, and Alex mentioned it. Planning needs to be along biodiversity and not just one against the other. We will always exist. We are one of the species, so we will interact with nature. There's no question. It's kind of how do we do it better. So it's not about no housing, it's how do we do better housing and stuff like that. So I think projects like yours are important. It's just how do we consider both in the same equation. Are you looking at me? It's good? I think we have to wrap up. So anyway, as I said, if you have any question, feel free to come ask any of the panelists. You can ask me a question. Thank you so much for being here today, and thank you for being advocates for nature.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much, Alexandre, Nina, Aoki, and David. So for participants, the session will reconvene at 5:50 later this evening.